3,000 years ago, the entire ancient world collapsed in a matter of decades. Empires that ruled for centuries burned to ash. Trade networks that connected continents vanished overnight. And for over 100 years, historians blamed ghost ships and phantom warriors, called the Sea Peoples. But what they didn't know was hiding in the bones of the dead, DNA that would finally reveal the truth about who these warriors really were. This is the story of how science solved one of history's greatest mysteries and taught us something essential about the fragility of civilization itself. The year is 11th Risaseed 7 BC. Imagine an ancient world as interconnected as our own. Egyptian pharaohs controlled the wealthiest empire on earth, ruling not only the Nile Valley, but also territories stretching into Palestine and southern Syria. The Hittites ruled Anatolia with an iron fist, controlling vast territories from their capital at Hattusa and dominating the political landscape of the ancient Near East. The Mycenaean Greeks dominated the Aegean with their powerful palaces and merchant fleets, with centers of power at Mycenae, Pylos, and other major palatial sites. Cyprus traded copper across the Mediterranean, providing one of the essential materials for making bronze. Syria and Canaan bustled with prosperous cities like Ugarit, which was one of the most important port cities in the entire ancient world. A merchant ship, like the one discovered off the coast of Uluburun in Turkey, carried cargo from Egypt, Cyprus, Canaan, Anatolia, and Greece all at once, demonstrating the complex web of trade that existed at this time. This wasn't the isolated ancient world we often imagine. This was a genuinely global civilization, knit together by trade routes that crisscrossed both land and sea, by military alliances and diplomatic exchanges, by shared knowledge and cultural exchange. Luxury goods flowed from one end of the Mediterranean to the other. Diplomatic correspondence between rulers shows sophisticated negotiations and mutual recognition of status. Merchant classes arose to handle the growing complexity of international trade. This was the world's first truly global economic system. Then everything changed. Within 50 years, nearly all of this collapsed. The Hittite Empire, which had dominated for centuries, fell. Its capital, Hattusa, burned so violently that the flames silenced its archives forever, preserving cuneiform tablets for history, but destroying the political continuity of one of the ancient world's greatest powers. The Mycenaean palace culture that had flourished for over 500 years crumbled into fragments. The palace centers where kings ruled were abandoned. The complex administrative systems that had managed trade and collected taxes simply ceased to exist. Cyprus saw its prosperity cut short. Cities that had known centuries of stability and trade suddenly saw their economic foundations evaporate. The cities of Syria and Canaan were destroyed, once thriving. Centers of trade and culture were reduced to burned ruins and abandoned sites. In Egypt, something that had never happened before occurred. The once mighty pharaohs lost control of their territories abroad. Egypt had enjoyed consistent territorial control for centuries, but in this period, that grip weakened. The empire contracted. The power that had seemed invulnerable proved to be vulnerable after all. The question that haunted historians for generations was simple but profound. Why? What could cause such a complete and utter collapse of an entire interconnected world? Surely something massive must have happened. Some force powerful enough to destroy multiple empires simultaneously. And the ancient texts seemed to provide an answer. Egyptian temple walls bore inscriptions describing a terrible threat. Pharaoh Ramesses III, standing against the overwhelming tide of invasion, recorded his desperate battle against enemies he called the peoples of the sea. They came in boats. They attacked from the water. They were relentless, organized, and seemingly unstoppable. They were called the Sea Peoples. For over a century, scholars built elaborate theories around these mysterious warriors. Some thought they were organized pirates. Others believed they were military expeditions from distant lands. Maybe they came from Sardinia, or Sicily, or even Northern Europe. The Sea Peoples became the convenient explanation for everything. They destroyed cities. They disrupted trade. They brought down empires. The story was clean, dramatic, and entirely wrong. The truth, it turned out, was far more complex and far more interesting. It wasn't one group of organized raiders who destroyed the Bronze Age. It was a cascade of failures, a perfect storm of environmental, economic, and social catastrophe. And most remarkably, the Sea Peoples themselves weren't conquerors. They were refugees. They were desperate people, driven from their homes by conditions so severe that it forced them into conflict and migration across the Mediterranean. This is the story that emerged from bones and DNA. This is what happened when ancient history met modern science. In the summer of 2019, scientists announced a discovery that would reshape our understanding of the Bronze Age collapse and the mystery of the Sea Peoples. A team of researchers led by Michael Feldman from the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History had been studying the ancient port city of Ashkelon, located in what is now Israel. During the Bronze Age, Ashkelon was a thriving Canaanite city controlled by Egypt, prosperous and integrated into the Mediterranean trade network. It was a major port city where merchants traded goods, and now where the flow of international commerce created a wealthy cosmopolitan population. The city's strategic location made it essential for controlling maritime trade in the region. During the Iron Age, it became something different, a Philistine city. The Philistines, described in the Hebrew Bible and Egyptian texts, were believed to be one of the groups that comprised the mysterious Sea Peoples. In biblical accounts, they were often portrayed as enemies of the ancient Israelites, the antagonists in stories of conflict and struggle. But archaeologists and historians had long wondered about their true origins. Where did they come from? How did they establish themselves so completely in the Levantine coast? Were they truly invaders and conquerors, or was there a different explanation? The researchers had excavated remains of individuals from Ashkelon, stretching across the Bronze Age and Iron Age transition. This excavation, directed by the Leon Levy expedition over nearly 2 decades, had carefully documented graves and burial practices across the chronological span that covered the critical period of the collapse. They extracted DNA from 10 of these individuals, 3 from the late Bronze Age, who lived before the transition, 4 from the early Iron Age who lived during the period of cultural change, and 3 from the later Iron Age who lived after the new society had established itself. This was no small feat. The southern Levant is not a place where DNA preservation is favorable. The warm, humid climate typically breaks down genetic material quickly, degrading the delicate chains of nucleotides that carry biological information. Bones in this region often yield nothing, their DNA destroyed by time and climate. But these researchers persisted, and their effort paid off. They managed to extract sufficient DNA from these 10 individuals to sequence whole genomes and conduct detailed genetic analysis. What they found was extraordinary. The individuals from the late Bronze Age carried DNA consistent with the local Levantine population. They were genetically identical to the broader Bronze Age communities of the region. But something remarkable happened around 1200 BC. When they analyzed the early Iron Age individuals, they found something different. These people showed a genetic component that was distinctly European. About 36 to 39% of their ancestry came from an Aegean Bronze Age population. This wasn't subtle. This wasn't marginal. This was a significant genetic admixture from southern Europe appearing suddenly in Ashkelon, arriving at precisely the time when the Sea Peoples were recorded in Egyptian texts. But there was more to the story. By the later Iron Age, this European genetic signature had faded. It was no longer detectable. Intermarriage had diluted the European ancestry to the point where it left virtually no trace in the genetic record. This told a crucial narrative. A migration had happened. A group of people with southern European ancestry had arrived in Ashkelon around the 12th. One particular individual in the study caught the attention of researchers. One of the early Iron Age males carried a Y chromosome haplogroup called R1b M269. This genetic marker indicated European lineage, further supporting the idea that people from southern Europe had migrated to this region. Another individual, one of the early Iron Age females, clustered genetically with Mycenaean populations from mainland Greece. These weren't coincidences or statistical anomalies. These were real people with documented European ancestry, buried in Ashkelon during the time when the Sea Peoples were attacking Egypt and the eastern Mediterranean. The implications were staggering. The Philistines, the Sea Peoples, or at least one group among them, were not raiders based in the Levant who decided to attack their neighbors. They were migrants from Europe who had arrived during a period of crisis, settling in coastal cities like Ashkelon, bringing with them their own cultural traditions, their own pottery styles, their own burial practices. But why were they there? What had driven them across the Mediterranean? That answer lay in understanding what was happening elsewhere in the world at this time. The ancient texts, particularly Egyptian temple inscriptions, recorded multiple groups comprising the Sea Peoples. The Peliset were believed to be the Philistines, the ones who settled in Canaan, but there were others. The Shurden, possibly from Sardinia, the Shekelesh, perhaps from Sicily. The Danaan, thought to be related to Greeks, the Checker, the Weshesh, and other groups. Egyptian records named at least 9 distinct tribes. These weren't random bands of pirates with nothing in common. They were coordinated groups from across the Mediterranean, appearing at roughly the same time, attacking the same targets, responding to similar pressures. What connected all these groups? What would cause populations from Sardinia, Sicily, Greece, and other Mediterranean lands to suddenly abandon their homes and strike out across the sea as armed migrants? The answer was becoming clearer as climate scientists dug into the evidence of the Bronze Age collapse. Around 1200 BC, the Mediterranean entered a period of severe and sustained drought that would fundamentally transform the region. This wasn't just a dry year or even a dry decade. This was a climatic shift that persisted for decades, fundamentally altering precipitation patterns and agricultural productivity across multiple regions simultaneously. Tree rings from that period showed drastically reduced growth, indicating weak harvests and stress on the trees trying to survive the dry conditions. Scientists who study these tree rings can count them like pages in a book, reading the climate record year by year. The pattern they found was clear and undeniable. Consistent years of reduced growth, the signature of drought stress. Pollen cores from the Sea of Galilee and Dead Sea revealed a massive shift in vegetation. The plants that require more moisture diminished in frequency, replaced by drought-resistant species. The botanical record preserved in lake sediments told a story of environmental transformation. Crop records from across the region documented repeated failures. Ancient tax records and administrative documents occasionally mention harvest yields, and these records show a clear pattern of decline. Anatolia suffered particularly badly, with multiple harvests failing in succession. Harvest failures cascade through ancient economies in ways that are hard to overstate. When you cannot feed your population, everything else becomes secondary. Diplomatic relationships break down as each region focuses inward on survival. Trade becomes impossible when no one has surplus to trade. Military strength diminishes as resources are diverted to feeding armies and populations. Entire societies teeter on the edge of survival as the fundamental basis of their economic systems, agricultural production, collapses. The researchers at Stockholm University, examining 8,000 years of Mediterranean climate data through advanced climate modeling and paleoclimate reconstruction, discovered something crucial about the droughts of the Late Bronze Age. Rather than being caused by a single climatic event, the most extreme droughts emerged when multiple natural climate cycles operating. Over different timescales coincided and reinforced one another. Multiple natural climate cycles had aligned in a perfect storm of climatic adversity. The Atlantic Ocean was in a particular phase that reduced moisture reaching the Mediterranean. These ocean cycles operate on timescales of decades, and their effects on atmospheric circulation can dramatically alter rainfall patterns. Earth's orbital cycles were driving a gradual drying, trend that had been building for thousands of years. Over very long timescales, the slow wobble of Earth's orbit changes how solar radiation is distributed across the planet, creating regions of persistent drying. Monsoon patterns had weakened, reducing rainfall from Africa that normally brought moisture into the Mediterranean region. Shorter-term atmospheric fluctuations added additional layers of complexity to the drying trend. When all these cycles coincided, when the long-term orbital trend met the medium-term ocean cycles and the shorter-term atmospheric variations, the result was catastrophic. This wasn't a single storm or a bad year. This was persistent, severe drought that lasted decades, creating the kind of agricultural stress that pre-industrial societies could not withstand indefinitely. In places like Anatolia and Greece, the consequences were devastating and unprecedented in their scope. Crops failed repeatedly. The expected harvests never materialized. Stored grain supplies that had been accumulated in palatial storerooms, designed to buffer against occasional bad years, dwindled as year after year failed to replenish them. Populations that had depended on steady harvests for centuries suddenly found themselves facing starvation. The palace economies of Mycenaean Greece, which had relied on carefully managed trade networks and accumulated wealth, became increasingly fragile and unstable. These economies had developed through centuries of stability with sophisticated systems for collecting taxes, storing surplus, and distributing resources. But these systems assumed that agricultural production would continue. They had no mechanism for handling sustained failure of the agricultural base. These weren't small, scattered communities that could adapt and survive as hunters or pastoralists, reverting to earlier subsistence strategies. These were complex. Societies with concentrated populations in cities and palatial centers, with populations that numbered in the thousands, all dependent on agricultural surplus. When agriculture failed, they failed. There was no fallback. There was no alternative subsistence strategy that could feed a palace court and its retainers and servants. Imagine being a Mycenaean Greek in about 1200 BC. Your family has lived in a palace center for generations, enjoying status and privilege that had been accumulating since the time of your ancestors. Your father was a nobleman, serving the palace and receiving his livelihood from the surplus produced by agricultural lands controlled by the palace administration. Your mother was from an important family connected through kinship ties to other important families. You speak Greek, worship the Greek gods in the familiar ways, participate in the cultural life of the palace, and have never known anything other than the comfort and security of palace life. But then the harvests begin to fail. The fields that had always produced reliable crops suddenly produce less. Year after year, the crops produce less. The pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The palace storerooms, filled with grain in normal years, start to feel less full. Stored grain runs out sooner than expected. Trade routes that brought food from Egypt or other regions become increasingly unreliable because those regions are suffering too. You hear stories of other palaces facing similar crises. Communication breaks down as distant regions focus on survival rather than maintaining diplomatic and trade relationships. People begin to leave the palace centers. Some migrate to smaller communities in the countryside. Some try to head to places that might have food, to regions that haven't been hit so hard by drought. Families disperse. The social bonds that held the palace system together begin to fray. As the crisis deepens, entire population groups become mobile, desperate, looking for anywhere that might sustain them. Some people take to the sea, knowing how to sail from their maritime traditions, hoping to find better conditions elsewhere in the Mediterranean. This was the situation unfolding across the eastern Mediterranean in the late 12th century BC. Populations were destabilized. Communities were fragmenting. People who had secure places and defined social positions found themselves displaced, hungry, and searching for survival. Some of these people from various Mediterranean regions found their way to the sea. Perhaps they were already maritime people with experience in sailing and naval warfare. Perhaps they had military experience from palace armies or mercenary work. These displaced populations, bound together by shared desperation rather than unified political leadership, began to move by sea toward regions that might offer better conditions. Egyptian records from this period describe multiple waves of attacks. Ramesses III, ruling Egypt during this turbulent time, faced invasion attempts on a scale that threatened the very existence of his kingdom. The attackers came by sea and by land. They attacked the Nile Delta. They threatened core Egyptian territory. In one famous inscription, Ramesses III describes his victory against these invaders, calling them the peoples of the sea. But what's striking about the Egyptian account is that it describes them not as an organized military force from a distant empire, but as multiple groups moving with their families, their possessions, and sometimes with their women and children. This sounds less like a military conquest and more like mass migration. Archaeological evidence from cities throughout the eastern Mediterranean bears witness to destruction on a scale that's hard to comprehend. Ugarit in Syria was destroyed so completely that its archives were baked by fire but preserved for posterity. The city never recovered. Cyprus saw its prosperity devastated. Smaller cities throughout the Levant show evidence of violent destruction. What makes this destruction interesting is that it's not ordered or systematic. It's not the result of a military campaign by an organized state. It's chaotic, scattered across multiple locations, appearing almost as if various groups were attacking independently, each trying to secure resources and territory. The destruction wasn't the end of the story. What happened after was equally important. In some places, new populations settled. Ashkelon, as the DNA evidence showed, saw the arrival of people with European ancestry who established themselves as the new population. They brought different pottery styles, pottery that looked like Aegean Mycenaean ware. They had different burial practices. They consumed different foods, particularly more pork than the local Levantine population had traditionally eaten. They had different architectural styles for their houses. In many ways, they seem to have maintained their cultural identity, at least initially. But over time, intermarriage and cultural mixing meant that by the Iron Age, these distinctions began to fade. The newcomers and locals became one people. What's remarkable about this story is that it completely inverts the traditional narrative. We were told that the Sea Peoples conquered the eastern Mediterranean, destroyed civilizations, and created the conditions for the collapse. But the DNA evidence and archaeological evidence together suggest something different. The Sea Peoples weren't conquerors. They were desperate, displaced people who were themselves products of a broader collapse. They didn't destroy the Bronze Age civilization. They emerged from its ruins. The true destroyer was climate. The true killer was drought. When harvests failed across the Mediterranean simultaneously, when populations that had depended on stable agriculture for centuries suddenly found that stability shattered, entire systems began to unravel. The palace economies of the Mycenaean world depended on trade. When trade routes became unreliable because the regions at the other end were also suffering, these economies collapsed. The Hittite Empire depended on controlling territory and extracting resources. When populations began migrating in desperation, when military resources were diverted to internal problems, the empire's grip weakened. The complex network of diplomatic and economic ties that held the Mediterranean world together frayed and broke. The Sea Peoples emerge in this narrative not as conquerors, but as one manifestation of this broader breakdown. They were populations displaced by climate crisis, moving to find new homes and resources. Some found those resources through peaceful settlement and trade. Others found them through violence and migration. But they were symptoms of the collapse, not causes. They were caught up in the same forces that destroyed the palace centers and disrupted the trade networks. This realization changes how we understand the Bronze Age collapse entirely. It wasn't a military defeat. It wasn't the result of some superior warrior culture overwhelming an inferior one. It was a systems collapse. When agricultural production failed across multiple regions simultaneously, when populations that had never been mobile suddenly needed to relocate, when every society was dealing with internal crisis simultaneously, the interconnected network that had supported Bronze Age civilization simply couldn't hold. Each node in the network was failing at the same time. No help could come from neighbors because those neighbors were also failing. No trade could rescue food supplies because everyone was suffering food shortages. And remarkably, this system's collapse, while catastrophic, wasn't necessarily the end of civilization. It was a transformation. In the chaos of the collapse, new civilizations emerged. Iron began to be worked more effectively than bronze. New societies formed, built on different foundations. The biblical Israelites emerged in this period. The Philistines established themselves along the Levantine coast. Greek populations, rather than living in palace centers, organized themselves in new ways that would eventually lead to the emergence of the city-state, the polis. The culture of ancient Greece that we know and admire, the culture of Athens and Sparta, emerged from the ashes of the palace-centered Mycenaean world. The scientific evidence for all this has accumulated gradually over the past 2 decades. The DNA evidence from Ashkelon provided a crucial piece of the puzzle, but it wasn't the only evidence. Pollen cores showing the botanical record of climate change, tree rings revealing poor growing conditions, archaeological layers showing destruction and abandonment, ancient texts describing desperate circumstances, and more recently, climate modeling studies that show exactly how natural climate cycles, when they align, can produce the specific drought pattern that struck the Mediterranean around 1200 BC. This multi-layered evidence has transformed the story of the Bronze Age collapse from a mystery about phantom warriors into a story of environmental catastrophe and human response to crisis. It's a story with particular resonance for our own time, when climate change is again driving migration and conflict. The story of the Sea Peoples also teaches us something crucial about historical interpretation. For generations, scholars relied on what the Egyptian texts told them, and the Egyptian texts did describe invasions, they described enemies, they described conflict. But those texts were written by the victors, by people trying to explain a catastrophe in terms they could understand and control. The idea that foreign invaders attacked their civilization was easier to conceptualize than the idea that internal systems were collapsing, that the very foundations of their world were shifting beneath them. The DNA evidence provided a different kind of testimony. Bones don't lie about political allegiances or motivations. DNA doesn't tell a story shaped by the needs of pharaohs or priests. DNA simply records inheritance, ancestry, movement of people across generations. When the Ashkelon DNA showed European ancestry appearing suddenly in the early Iron Age, it was documenting a fact that no amount of interpretation could alter. People from Europe had arrived in the Levant around 1200 BC. That fact, combined with all the other evidence, helped us see the collapse differently. The implications of this reinterpretation are significant. The Bronze Age collapse demonstrates a cascading failure pattern. When you have a complex, interconnected system, the failure of one node cascades through the entire network. The drought disrupted the entire Mediterranean trade network. The collapse of Mycenaean palaces led to migration and military action. Each failure fed into the next, creating a systems-level breakdown. In our modern world, we have systems that are equally complex. Our supply chains, our financial systems, and our communication networks could theoretically experience similar cascading failures. Understanding how the ancient Mediterranean world failed helps us understand vulnerabilities in our own systems. The story of the Sea Peoples also reminds us of the human dimension of climate change. When we talk about droughts in ancient history, we're not just talking about climate data and botanical records. We're talking about people. People who had nowhere to go. People whose children were hungry. People who made desperate choices because their circumstances were desperate. People who migrated across the sea, who fought for survival, who tried to establish new lives in new places. This wasn't abstract history. It was human tragedy on a massive scale. Yet from tragedy came renewal. The collapse wasn't the end of civilization. It was a transition to something different. The Greeks who survived eventually created the culture that gave the world philosophy, democracy, and theater. The Philistines became part of Mediterranean civilization. The peoples of the Levant adapted and changed. The DNA evidence from Ashkelon powerfully illustrates this adaptation. The early Iron Age population showed clear genetic markers of European origin. But by the later Iron Age, these markers had faded, not because the European people had left or been killed, but because they had married local women, because over generations the distinct genetic signatures of the migration had been diluted through natural demographic processes. This is what successful settlement and integration looks like in the genetic record. Newcomers arrive, establish themselves, and gradually blend with existing populations. It's a story of adaptation and synthesis, not conquest and replacement. The ancient world moved on. The Mediterranean world rebuilt itself on new foundations. And today, thanks to advances in genetic science, we can look at the bones of people who lived 3,000 years ago and read the story written in their DNA. We can see that they were not phantom warriors or invaders, but real people who experienced real catastrophe and responded with human resilience. We can see that the fall of the Bronze Age was not caused by some external force of conquest, but by the collision of environmental crisis and interconnected systems breaking down simultaneously. The mystery of the Sea Peoples has not been fully solved. There is still much we don't know. We don't know exactly which Mediterranean regions sent the most migrants. We don't know all the details of the migration routes or the exact timelines. We don't know the stories of individual groups or why some regions were more affected than others. But we know enough now to say that our old explanations were wrong. The Sea Peoples were not conquerors. They were displaced people, caught in a catastrophe they didn't cause, trying to survive in a world that was falling apart. And that story, perhaps, is more interesting and more instructive than the old tale of mysterious raiders, because it tells us about real historical processes. It shows us how climate and society interact. It demonstrates the fragility of even the most impressive civilizations when multiple crises occur simultaneously. And it reminds us that history is not just about great battles and famous leaders. It's also about ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the face of extraordinary circumstances. The bones in Ashkelon and the DNA within them speak across 3,000 years to tell us this story. And if we listen carefully, they have something to teach us about our own world and our own time.